Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Truxas, and I would like to welcome you to the last episode of our second series of Hidden Histories. I am the executive director of the Portland Chinatown Museum, and we are so thrilled to host Jocelyn Lee for this penultimate session. So, before we get started, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River region, whose lands the City of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Witlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribe of Grand Ronde, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, whose descendants are today members of the Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and Siletz Confederated Tribes of Oregon. I have a bit of a cold too today, so. Hidden Histories was made possible in part with the generous support and partnership of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. The OCDP is an award-winning grassroots local, state, federal partnership that was conceived and initiated in underserved rural communities in southern and eastern Oregon. The research generated through these public archaeology projects is helping to update and center the history of the Chinese diaspora and Chinese Oregonians in the development of the state. In today's presentation, archaeologist Jocelyn Lee will share the history of the lesser-known mining camp, Althouse, and the Chinese miners who worked there. And a quick bio about Jocelyn. Jocelyn is a PhD candidate in archaeology and anthropology at Stanford University. Her dissertation is on Chinese diaspora archaeology in Oregon, looking at the movement between labor camps and small community centers in rural landscapes. In addition, Jocelyn's research seeks to connect archaeological interpretations with present-day communities through the combination of countermapping, archival, and material analysis to help understand contemporary Chinese Americans' conception of historical places. In the summer of 2023, she led a Passport in Time, aka PIT, project along with the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest on a Chinese mining camp in southern Oregon to investigate Chinese American history in Oregon. And we're so thrilled to have Jocelyn. She's a wonderful friend of the museum. We've had one of her wonderful maps up in our museum space for quite some time now, and it does gather incredible information. Just two kind of logistical notes before we get started. We have turned on closed captions, and we are taking questions at the end. You can add your questions and comments to the chat or the question and answer, and Sarah Capiolani and I will do our best to get to all of them. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Jocelyn Lee. Thank you.
I guess I'll share my screen now. Everyone can see this okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anna, for that introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming to this presentation. So today I will be talking about the history of Chinese Americans in Althouse, Oregon, and how archaeology can tell us more about the movement of Chinese Americans across really both California and the Oregonian landscape. And for the sake of simplicity, in this talk, I will be using the term Chinese American as really a catch-all term for the population I'm talking about today. There's a couple of reasons for this. One of them being that I think it really allows all of us part of this Chinese diaspora to feel this extra layer of connection to these histories. And it also really asserts that the stories I am talking about today is very much part of American history. So to get started, here is a map that shows Josephine County, Oregon. We're in the rough location of Althouse as shown by the little star. And I think there's folks in the audience that's not too familiar with either landscape, especially from like a non-large urban city perspective. So just to emphasize, like Portland is all the way up north past like Eugene, and San Francisco is very much further down south. And you can see that Althouse is very close to the border between the two states. So gold was found in Suttermill, California in 1848, and by around 1851, this gold rush had reached the Siskiyou Mountains on the border between the two states, including in Josephine County that was outlined in the map. Various mining tax laws and exclusionary policies were really at the backdrop of this landscape. Um, and there was also language in the state constitution that forbade Chinese Americans from owning mining claims, and there was a requirement to pay a poll tax. And these kind of exclusionary laws and language are really important to keep in mind as they do shape the way that Chinese Americans had to navigate the space, often being forced to use mining claims that were already used up by other Euro Americans. And gold was discovered in Outhouse Creek in 1852 by the Althouse brothers through prospecting. In 1855, the Crescent City Herald newspaper noted that there was about 14 miles of diggings consisting of south and southeast forks, and that companies are making at least $5 a day with the occasional large strikes. For the next couple of decades, this place remained fairly fruitful and attracted hundreds of people. And by 1857, there was reported to be about 300 to 400 men on the creek, all finding success. From 1850s to 1890s, newspaper accounts illustrate that Althouse remained a really good area to work in, even though it was quite laborious. But by 1892 and 1893, there was reported to be about 500 miners on the creek, with up to 6 companies making on average $10 a day. In 1893, they found the largest gold nugget in Oregon at 64 ounce. Um, and I found this really great romanticized but really vivid picture of Althouse I wanted to share with you. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's really long, but emphasizing that this place was a veritable variegated menagerie of human life and undress. Like all early mining camps, Althouse is predominantly cosmopolitan. And you can read the rest of it on your by yourself if you want, but it really just like paints this picture of like what mining camps was back in the day and how even though I am talking about Chinese miners, it wasn't just Chinese miners in the area, and there was all kinds of people, race, ethnicity, so, and even though the description was obviously exaggerated, and there was also definitely far from quote unquote little trouble, as it says in the quote, because there seemed to be plenty of casual robbery and looting between miners, farmers, and the general population in the area. And for example, there was an account of plums and other fruits getting stolen repeatedly in a series of robberies. Um, Unfortunately, by 1900, one writer does describe how his father saw a great exodus of the early miners from the mines of Althouse and nearby camps to the British Columbia, and the majority had never returned. The earliest mention of Chinese miners in this area was in 1857, when newspaper claims that about three-quarters of the population were Chinese. In 1881, also indicates that Chinese miners got about $1 a day, and by 1885, there were descriptions of Chinese mining companies in Althouse. Unfortunately, within a few years, the Portland Oregonian newspaper notes that most of Chinese miners had left this area to work on the railroad extension in California and Oregon. Um, and while some likely did leave, in 1899, there were still Chinese miners engaged on the creek mining the old bars. And again, according to the Portland Oregonian, they were content if they were making 50 cents to $1 a day to the man, and worked almost exclusively. Creek beds have been sluiced out multiple times. Here are really old historic photos I was able to find with the help of some of my colleagues that are Chinese miners working on Althouse. But there's the references to Chinese miners are unfortunately pretty minimal. And the most common instances are often when they like talk about selling a claim to Chinese miner or company, or when there was a disagreement. Although there was one account by a storekeeper between 1851 to 1869, where he met Chinese miners and how he described them as opposite to a lot of the stereotypes of like dirty and frugal. And instead, they were kept themselves really clean by bathing in the water, and they treated the storekeepers with, quote, the best victuals such as pies, cakes, roast pigs, oysters, and soup or oyster pie, and all kinds of canned goods and fresh meat the market afforded. Um, and another description by William Mackey in 1935 described that Chinese miners were really apt at saving gold and worked for themselves as low as 25 cents a day after board and expenses were paid. Their methods when living were compelled by necessities were very cheap, and they ate quote unquote steamed breads, which I assume refers to mantou, with rice, chunk cabbage, which they grew on the spot and stuff. And Browntown was in a really close town to the east of Althouse and has often been referred to as the metropolis of Althouse, as well as catering to those working around all the mining claims around. It was the principal congregating point for miners. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a historical photo of Browntown. Um, But so a lot of farmers in both Oregon and California would bring their produce, such as butter, flour, fruit, etc., to Browntown to sell to the miners working in Althouse. And according to previous Forest Service research, by 1854, Browntown had two bakeries, 10 stores, four hotels, a bowling alley, seven saloons, three blacksmiths, and two dance or fancy houses. As late as 1880, there was a newspaper account of Chinese miners reusing an old mining claim in Browntown. And apparently, Chinese miners would come into Browntown and use the banks to send money back to China, as well as go into the town for a supply. Um, and then another important place in the area is Waldo. It's also commonly referred to along with Outhouse and Browntown, as miners and gamblers really went back and forth between each place. It was the gold was discovered by a band of sailors. And at one point it was the largest town in Josephine County and served as the depot of supplies for miners and farmers for all miles around. Chinese miners arrived in Waldo as early as 1850s, and there was a sizable population that created a Chinatown. According to the census, there were laundrymen, packers, cooks, merchants, gamblers, a keeper of a boarding house. The Chinatown did consist of several small buildings in a row that did include a store and, of course, a boarding house. And one account noted that, quote, in all our tour, we noticed that Chinese Americans are gradually supplanting the white miners in this section of the country. China goods are in the stores, and China customers are not infrequently there also. It is impossible to ascertain what they are making, but they are mostly working the diggings have been deserted or sold to them by white men. And the Chinese American population was studied well into the 1880s, despite the decline of white miners in the area. Waldo was abandoned roughly in 1920s, and the last store, the George Elder store, closed in 1928. And one person recalled that Althouse, Sailor Digging, Sucker Creek, in the olden days, there was magic to those names. They were names to conjure with Browntown, Hogtown, Frenchtown, and Napoleon. Where are they? You will not find them marked down on any map. You will find them only in the memories of Oregon's pioneers. Yet in their day, they were places of importance. And I pull this quote to kind of keep painting this picture that places like Althouse can and do play a role in people's imaginations, especially in thinking about the histories of this area, and hence really the importance of learning it beyond the idea of it's like one of the earliest mining areas in Oregon. The picture here is from the archaeological investigations of the Waldo Cemetery that took place in 2012 by Sula using pedestrian survey, and this survey did include a Chinese cemetery. And then here, I just thought I would throw out some numbers. This is the census for all of Josephine County between 1860 and 1920. And you can see here that from like 1860 to 1880, there was a huge count of population. And of course, they were mostly males. And I did separate out miners as an occupation just because it's predominantly the people that we are talking about. But the other occupations do include like blacksmith, butcher, cook, doctor, gambler, hotel keeper, laborer, laundryman, and mule packer. Um, so the connection between Althouse, Browntown, and Waldo, and honestly throughout the county and the general area, shows that something that many other Euro Americans were doing in the 19th and 20th century. They were all on the move. Chinese miners may have been in Althouse, but they definitely were not just staying there. And small towns like Browntown and Waldo became really key to folks of all races and ethnicities in these areas to provide them with different kinds of goods and additional opportunities. And of course, specific to the Chinese Oregonians, we know that they often did switch jobs to pursue various economic opportunities. And if you want to learn more about these, please go listen to the other hidden histories. Um, so focusing on this idea of not just movement, but constant like local movement within the context of Chinese American history is an important one in these areas just because they work different kinds of iterant labor. And these stories really differ drastically than some of the more commonly told stories about urban Chinatowns, where there was a slightly greater chance of folks staying in one place for longer periods of time. This then, of course, impacted their lifestyles, and for us archaeologists, it really translates into different roles the object play in their lives. So, Althouse. The actual site was surveyed by Forest Service archaeologists in 1893 and 2021. In 2021, they expanded the site boundary to show the presence of surface artifacts and different mining features. But the survey kind of showed a scatter of objects you would typically find at a Chinese American mining site, such as different kinds of pottery, both of China and Euro-American manufacture. There was glass, fragments with Chinese characters, etc. There was also an associated hearth, which we were able to explore more in 2023. So in 2023, we conducted 4.5 days of field work that included excavation, pedestrian survey, and metal detecting. And this was done in partnership and sponsorship of the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest and the Southern Oregon Laboratory of Anthropology and the Oregon Archaeological Society. This project was part of Passport in Time that some of you guys might be familiar with. And with various visitors that came for a day or two, we had a total of about 40 people on site doing all sorts of jobs. Um, and then here I have a couple of photos I really want to show you guys because it showed the slope that our crew had to hike down. And this really wasn't the easiest project to get access to. And every single participant on this project just absolutely killed it hiking at this slope twice a day for 4.5 days. But not just us, right? This also shows the landscape that Chinese miners and the population back then had to navigate through. But this map also gives another idea of the extent of slope as well as kind of showing some of our excavation area. The little triangle is what the smaller area that we investigated, and that big star where you see that really flatness, that's the main area that we excavated. And this is also a somewhat typical archaeology map, those of you who might be a little bit unfamiliar with. So you see that we have a little legend at the bottom and the scale. Um, And for those of you who are familiar with archaeology, you might also secretly be wondering how deep we excavated, because if there's one thing archaeologists love, it's stratigraphy. But you're going to be disappointed. The nature of these ephemeral labor camps means that the signature left on the ground do not resemble those like huge profiles you might have seen. Sometimes if you go to certain museums, you get to see those like really deep, like multi-feet like stratigraphy that you can pull up. This is not. We went down to like maybe 30 centimeters below surface for a lot of our units. The exception being Unit 1, where there was the hearth, that we went down to 85 below surface just to go past the rocks. Um, so, and then here's just another map of the excavation that we had, and to give you an idea. Um, so the large squares are the excavation units, and then of course there was a rock pile that you see up in the little corner, and then the little circles that are shaded, that kind of out of nowhere are trees. And TU6 at the bottom, I also wanted to kind of point out just because that was actually on a slope, and so we didn't go with the traditional way of like actually going down that far. We really just like surface scrape to see like what kind of artifacts we can get. Um, and then, like I said, we did a lot of pedestrian survey and metal detecting. So this is a photo of metal detecting. We got a total of 106 GPS points, and we could not and did not collect every single thing we found in these surveys, because if we did, I would 100% still be processing the nail fragments or can fragments. And at a certain point, as archaeologists, we have to ask ourselves whether or not another broken nail or another broken can is going to drastically change the narrative. And considering the sheer amount of objects that we did have from excavation, we knew we could not collect every single metal detected object. The archaeology proved that there was absolutely something here. There was some sort of campsite, and the glass, which is one of the classes of objects that tell us the most, dates the site pretty solidly to the mid 19th century. And another significant aspect to this excavation was the mapping, which I've shown you a sample of the maps. While the mapping, the portion goes beyond this excavation. And if you are in the Portland area, you should go see Portland Chinatown Museum to see my other mapping exhibit. Unfortunately, this is not the focus of my talk. But yeah, go check out Portland Chinatown Museum. Uh, but another final thing about the site is that it was part of the 2020 Slater fire that started September 8 in the Klamath National Forest in Northern California that crossed the California and Oregon border within hours, and it wasn't contained until November 3rd. The fire burned almost 9,000 acres, and as a result of this fire, a large portion of the material culture that was found is burned. And this is very relevant once I start talking about the artifacts. You'll see that the fire had the most visible and dramatic impact on the glass and ceramics object. So now to everyone's favorite question, what did we find? Well, the total artifact in terms of both fragmented and whole objects is about 7,300. However, this count isn't the most representative because there are things like these small metal sheet fragments that get broken up really easily, and so those counts are honestly pretty meaningless. But even without that, there's over 7,000 artifacts for sure, and for 4.5 days of work, that is a kind of ridiculous amount of things to pull up. So the other way we can understand how much we pulled up is by thinking about the weight, which ended up being almost 43,000 grams, which is just under 95 pounds. And so I have a picture here of like why count and weight are necessary. If I'm being completely honest, this bag of metal sheet fragments is probably going to increase in count over time, if not already, just because they're so fragile. They're small and they're largely unidentified. They can be an indefinite amount of things. So weight is just really another accurate way to stay constant over time. And nails are pictured because we have an obscene amount of nails and they include different sizes, different types of broken. And sometimes if you only look at the middle parts of the body, they can either be 1 or 3 nails. So weight is just equally important in terms of thinking about how much artifacts we have. And now talking about fire. This is what I mentioned earlier when I said the forest fire kind of like did some damage to the objects. Um, so the most visible extreme cases were the glass. You can see that some of them became really distorted and basically entirely unrecognizable. Unfortunately for us, there are glass objects that have distinct color. So as long as they retain that color, we can figure out what they are. So like these olive green glass, they're most likely some sort of alcohol bottle. Others became kind of just distorted enough that we can guess what they are, but we're not quite certain. So on the upper right-hand corner here, it kind of looks like the right size-ish for a Chinese medicine bottle. So we're pretty sure that's kind of what that is. And then another one is the one at the bottom here, where it's the top of a bottle, but it has been distorted and has just enough that we can kind of know a little bit about it, but definitely not if it was unimpacted by the fire. So fire impacted about 77% of the total assemblage, the total glass assemblage, and 42% of which were completely unrecognizable, unfortunately. And then for ceramics, the most obvious are these things called Chinese brown glaze stoneware. So here are some examples that I got from Sula's database of like what they would look like completed. The like wide mouth jar is one of the most common ones that we find, and this other one that we see as the more narrow, that's an alcohol jar. And so you can see that like without it being fire impacted, it kind of has like this like shininess to it. And then meanwhile, all the other ones that look a little bit more roughened up, that's because of the fire. Um, so luckily, when we were excavating, luckily, like one of my absolutely brilliant colleagues caught this really early on, and so it showed everyone what to look for. Otherwise, the reality is that if we were to see some of these out in the field and not realizing what they were, they could have easily been mistaken as rocks or something else. And then the corner there, that is actually a porcelain fragment that's been impacted by the fire. So fire impacted ceramics represents about 68% of the total weight in ceramics, of which about half of that are CBGS, these glaze guys. Um, Other material types did not see nearly the same degree of fire damage as glass or ceramic. For the record, we found very, very little bone, so it didn't really matter all that much. So when we were thinking, as mentioned before, I really am talking about this in the context of movement. So when we do think about objects moving, we can think about how individual objects may have traveled a far distance in terms of like manufacturing. In 2026, what the chances of anything that we're holding actually being manufactured locally is pretty slim, right? Our phones, our water bottles, our computers, etc. And so that is one approach that archaeologists have taken to thinking about the movement of objects. On sites related to Chinese Americans, it's really easy to look for movement from that perspective just because of the sheer amount of like China-made objects. For example, some of the ones that have traveled the farthest distance is probably these Chinese coins. We have one that says Dao Guang Tongbao, which is the Daoguang Emperor. Another one that says Qianlong Tongbao, which references the Qianlong Emperor. And both of these were very obviously made in China. It's hard to say whether or not like they were, with the Chinese minor, Chinese American minor, Chinese American individuals like from the beginning, or at what point they became part of this group of people, etc. It's a more unlikely because Qianlong's reign is 1736 to 1795. So that one basically how far these particular objects travel with this group of miners is really hard to say. But if you want to look at movement in terms of where it was manufactured and the distance that they traveled themselves, like objects like this are really great for thinking about that. And similarly, from a manufacturer perspective, there's also objects made in other parts of the US. So here I have maps that my colleagues and dear friends Kim Connor and Katie Johnson have made about other Chinese diaspora projects. So on the top here is Johnson's thesis that show the axis of goods all along the West Coast for the Jacksonville Chinese Quarter, while the one on the right shows Connor's research on the extent of domestic glass found on Chinatown site in San Jose called Market Street, Chinatown. And then this one's the same idea, but it's on a global scale. And again, same thing, Johnson on the left and Connor on the right. So thinking about movement is really cool and fascinating and tells us a lot about how objects travel and really the nitty-gritty that are involved in making things move and get to us. And similarly, how globally connected all of this is, right? Like a single object doesn't just show up in one place, but it has all these stories that are embedded in thinking about spaces and how they get to us, and even like how people are traveling along with these objects. But what I'm really interested in is kind of how miners and laborers and everyday workers have moved on the landscape once they get here on the local landscape. And so I want to invite everyone here to think about how, if they are traveling, how you would pack your things. It can be a road trip, it can be a flight. Point is, there's going to be some sort of space limitation. So for a flight, there's probably a carry-on limit for an airline, or if you're taking a road trip, your car can only be so big. You probably need to travel light, or you at least need to be very intentional on what it is you're bringing and what you're leaving. And so, because of that, there's a couple of objects I really want to highlight for this talk, especially when we are keeping that framework of movement in mind. Looking at specific objects, my question kind of is like, how portable is it? How easily accessible and how replaceable is it? Remember that we are talking about a group of miners who are regularly on the move, which means what they bring with them, what they left behind places, is going to be fairly curated or intentional to an extent. So, like, they're probably not going to be carrying a whole lot of broken things with them from site to site unless it holds a significant meaning or unless there was another use to it. I want to begin with the category of objects that probably did not travel as far, such as like containers that held single-use substances. And there's so many things that go in this category, including all kinds of cans, glass bottle jars, ceramic containers, etc. They hold everything from different kinds of like food-related items of sauces, spices, to drugs, medication and recreational alcohol, miscellaneous everyday items like motor oil, bathroom necessities, etc. For the sake of the length of this presentation, we're not going to be going over every single kind of item in that category. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking forever. And instead, I'm going to highlight just a few. So the first one is Chinese medicine bottles, simply because they were commonly single use or at least fairly short term if they contain like the small round pills. Being so small and of a particular shape, these bottles were likely not reused and luckily would be and thus would be discarded. As a result, we did find, and we do tend to find a couple of these on these labor-based archaeology sites. Unfortunately, due to the fire, the Chinese medicine bottles we do have been pretty heat altered, as you can see here. If it weren't for the fact that they're so like particularly shaped, like diagnostic, like the bottleneck and the small size of it, we probably would not have been able to identify it. There were a couple of other ones that had potential to be Chinese medicine bottles, but it was just too heat altered to us to be able to say definitively. Um, we found a total of 9 fragments of these. Um, so, um, And so there were two Chinese American doctors listed in the Josephine County census in 1870. So it's very possible that these were fairly local. Alternatively, Chinese miners at Althouse could have also gotten these from like Jacksonville or Medford or further south, even from Wairika or Happy Camp, where there was like a larger Chinatown, possibly to get them more access to these. And then next we have tobacco. So tobacco related objects were found in the form of tobacco tags as seen here. They were introduced in the mid 19th century and were used to label and seal tobacco tins. So at Outhouse, we found quite a bit. We found 35 tobacco tags, including some of these brands I have featured here, like Sun, Bengal, Teaser, JB Pace. This is the only image on the internet I could find of related to one of these brands of tobacco tins. But you can see how like the tobacco tag is literally on that logo. And we also found one tobacco can at the top there. Um, and then similarly related to tobacco, we have found quite a bit of opium related objects. And at Alt House, we found a wide range of opium tins as well as opium pipe bowls and pipe bowl rack. So we have here on this slide opium tins and the pipe bowl rack. And the one on the left here has Lai Yun, bad Cantonese pronunciation, my bad. That's also been found in other places. That photo for comparison is thanks to the Chinese and Northwest Research Committee website. And then the one, the bottom thing here, that is a pipe bowl rack. And on the top, you see that's just a more, I guess, more typical opium tin that doesn't have Chinese characters. But you can also see like the fire did impact these pretty intensely. Um, so serious smokers would have had a lot more bowls and pipes, which means that these other parts were probably discarded for various reasons. Maybe they broke, they fell off, or whatever was holding them, or simply forgotten. These bowls were made out of ceramic, while the pipe was wood, bamboo, or ivory. We found a total of 28 fragments, 21 of which were mended as five separate objects. And so here are some of the examples of that. Um, the latest opium research shows that they were more personal and they were more likely to have traveled with an individual. And I do think that we have some pretty interesting fragments here, like the one that has a little flower on it, and this other one that has these stamps. This is a microscopic photo of it. I realize the scale isn't on here for some reason, but this is a very, very small fragment. Um, and if anyone can read what's actually in the center, please let me know. But we're pretty confident that the one on the left here is these two characters of Tang and Gao, and on the far right is the character Shui or water. And then, of course, there's all the ceramics, the plates, the bowls, the mugs, etc. We have some, though not a whole lot of Chinese porcelain. So here are some examples of like the liquor cups that we found, as well as the spoons. The spoons are on the top two photos here. And for those of you that are unsure what I'm talking about for the Chinese spoon, here's a, unbroken spoon with kind of circle parts. So you see that the design is like narrow handle, whereas that bottom part is kind of that like bowl part of the spoon. And of course we have bowls. These images show fragments of different kinds of Chinese porcelain bowls, a much more completed and far less heat altered double happiness bowl that Doug is holding, and a small fragment of bamboo and a small burnt fragment of another double happiness bowl. In terms of like Euro-American tableware, we have one mug and multiple fragments that I wasn't able to completely mend and take a photo of. I would need to be like an octopus with like 8 arms. But it was really cool. And then we also have a couple of saucers. Because of just how few examples we have of these objects, I'm inclined to think that like they were intentional to a certain extent, or that they were missing objects to drink or eat out of, and that like mugs and saucer are simply to get easier to get in these more remote locations. My current theory is that like the shape and the size of saucer make just shallow enough of a bowl that it kind of mimics drinking alcohol from a bowl that a lot of like Chinese people do tend to do. And so here is a, oh, oops. Um, this is a picture of the mug from the top, so you can see that curvature. Um, and then here's kind of completed objects for reference as to like what they may have looked like. So these tableware, along with like the opium pipe bowls, are interesting in that they're definitely like not just the single-use containers that were used to hold things. And instead, they probably traveled an X amount of distance, going from site to site, and then finally having Althouse as their final resting place. Alternatively, especially with the saucer, it could just be that they were easy to access, and the miners just needed a few extra drinking containers or something like that. Um, and now we move on to the two main characters of the site. And I'm really excited about this part. So the first is a modified can. Beginning with the idea of temporary, we have this can. This was found in the kind of the upper part of the excavation where we didn't excavate as much, but there was a lot of surface objects. This can is only about 1 pound, for 51 grams or so. And it's so super light, but it's modified from an everyday can of some sort. You can really see the soldering marks if you look at like where that spout and that hole is. Um, and you can see how like they pull the handle. It looks like they kind of pull that thing back to like have a little handle. So we know that this object was intentional. You know, someone modified this to look like this for a particular reason. And because of it, so as such, this is really one of our mystery objects that I've asked for opinions on various Chinese American members, as well as archaeologists, people in the audience. You might have been guilty of me asking you what you think of this object. Um, and at the end of this presentation, if anyone else has other ideas or thoughts, please do share them with me. But in general, like the groups of people that I've talked to, we do agree that this was probably used for oil of some sort. There's a bit of disagreement on what kind of oil. Some believe that it's for cooking, others believe that it's for machinery. And for anyone familiar with 19th and 20th century historic sites, know that you can find like an obscene amount of can remains. And there's literally archaeological features called can dumps for a reason, and that name is exactly what it sounds. It's a giant dump of cans. You know, our wonderful, brilliant colleagues, Jackie and Eric, did a whole talk on a cannery of Chinese Oregonians in Dallas, to kind of to further prove this point. And in 19th and 20th century, these cans like held everything from food to tobacco, household cleaners, talcum powder, etc. They're obviously light and easy to transport, easy to modify. So just even addition, so the cans aside, like thinking about how often as archaeologists we find modified objects on like labor-related camps, it's really not surprising that we found something like this, but it doesn't take away kind of like the cool and mystery factor to it. And in the context of movement, while we don't necessarily know for sure, it's probably that this object did not travel the same distance as some of these farther objects. Just, we're really not sure how often this object was used and whether this was a substitute for something they no longer have or couldn't find. But just considering kind of how fragile and light, how easy to access this material is, there probably wasn't a reason to carry this thing from site to site on top of everything else they would have needed to bring along with them. On the other end of the spectrum, and still within kind of the realm of thinking about tools, the sledgehammer head was found on the surface of the sloped area between that two main excavation areas. There's so many reasons why this object is interesting and why it's become absolutely a favorite of mine for any public events. And one of them is the weight of it. The weight of it is a whopping 14.3 pounds. Now you might be like, only 14 pounds. But those of you who have held it know that it feels so much heavier than just 14.3 pounds. In fact, one of my favorite games to play with this object on public days is to have folks pick it up and guess how much it weighs. And more often than not, I get a lot of people claiming that it has to be at least 30 plus pounds. And keep in mind that a quick Google search tells you that modern day sledgehammer weighs anywhere from 6 to 20. So the fact that people are thinking that it like weighs more than 30 says a lot about kind of our mindset about these objects, right? Um, and then the other characteristic of this object is just like how ridiculously used it is. Like if you guys pay attention to the other either side of like the extreme mushrooming, This wasn't just a tool that was used occasionally. This was used repeatedly over and over again until it reached the stage. I'm not entirely sure that the sledgehammer is technically still usable, and so, it had to be discarded at some point. And for those of you that are used to working with tools, this might not seem like a big deal, but let's also put in the context of like how American public has tended to see Chinese Americans and notions of masculinity. And for a long time, Asian American masculinity broadly has been portrayed as being more feminine. Asian American scholars, influencers, the general public have all known, written, and spoken about this. There's been a very consistent narrative that Asian American men are effeminate and weak, or being portrayed in media as the sidekicks, the martial arts villain, or nerds. It doesn't take too much of a Google search just to see even how pervasive this narrative of Asian American masculinity is, even in 2026. So this 14.3 pound sledgehammer really goes against that narrative of this weak, effeminate, nerdy Asian American man. The fact that it is so heavy and the fact that it's so incredibly used, let's just say that regardless of the physique of Chinese miners, they certainly were not skipping arm day at the gym. So instead of the scrawny caricature working the mines, we can picture people like Simu Liu or Minnie Jacinto, and let's just pretend that it's a sledgehammer on either side of the weapons for fun. So masculinity aside, now let's think about the sledgehammer in the context of Chinese Americans moving around. There's a good chance that this sledgehammer was brought from site to site, working at different mining rural camps. For a tool like sledgehammer, they probably were not eager to constantly replace it. So after working who knows how many different places, jobs, this particular claim at Althouse became the final resting place of this object, where this sledgehammer head, which may have started out significantly heavier, became unusable due to how worn down it is. So along with similar objects, we also have remains of other tools such as like shovels and mining pans and even like fragments of cast iron pots in terms of like thinking about the heaviness of it. These are all like quite substantial in their size, though none of these fragments are comparable to the weight of the sledgehammer head. In addition, kind of shovels, buckets, mining pans, etc., are all common objects we found in mining camps. For example, Ahang and Ai in Eastern Oregon, we found multiple shovel and mining and pick fragments. And we often find way more of these guys in comparison to sledgehammer head, and that's probably because like the sledgehammer is just far more durable than either of these objects. And then there's of course the physical aspect of it. We found evidence of like folks modifying shovels, and they can be easily modified. And it makes sense. Let's like it takes some pretty crazy person to try to modify a sledgehammer in comparison to these other objects. So in thinking about movement, if large tools like shovels and mining pans and picks are much easier to transport, modify, possibly even cheaper in comparison to a sledgehammer, then most likely a single sledgehammer head would have traveled far longer in terms of both time and distance with the mining individual or company. And so archaeological record aside, we can also look at the historical documents. One of the most helpful historical documents for looking at objects are store ledgers. They often list types of the type of object, cost, quantity, along with account name and date. In these last few years, since I've started working on Oregon Chinese diaspora sites, I've been privileged to work on a couple of different ledgers that are either Chinese Americans or have Chinese American accounts on them. The one I've worked on most extensively is the Chang ledgers in Eastern Oregon. And while spatially these seem like super far out, they're actually really relevant in thinking about pattern of movement, where it's a small town that played a big, big role in the larger dispersed mining or other forms of iterant labor. More recently and more spatially relevant, I've been working closely with the Kubli store ledger, which is um, it's located in Southern Oregon. While we can't be sure as to whether or not all house miners were actively using this store for their outhouse needs, it's always possible that it was a stopping point at one time or another as Chinese American laborers travel through the landscape of Northern California and Southern Oregon. Unfortunately, the only Chinese store ledgers I have seen on in Southern Oregon is from Jacksonville. That's the 1882. And if anyone in the audience knows of something or you're willing to share, please let me or my colleagues know, as we would love to learn more. So what do these ledgers tell us and why am I talking about them? The single-use objects that I mentioned earlier, like tobacco and opium, will definitely come up in them. Tobacco is often simply listed as tobacco, whereas there's this distinction between opium box and opium pipe at Kublai store. In other Euro-American Eastern Oregon stores, they've also distinguished between tobacco and tobacco pouch, with tobacco occurring in far greater frequency. In addition, Kanma Chung also listed tobacco. Both tobacco and opium box likely refers to the short-term stuff that I mentioned and kind of like the opium tins and stuff. So there was likely more need to replenish them often in comparison to like the pouch or the pipes. And then for like things like Chinese porcelain, we can compare them in the Chinese language ledgers. So this is the Jacksonville Chinese ledger. Um, and then so we're lucky that we found some examples of references to these bowls, and the ones overlaid are ones from a Kamachong. We also know that at Kublai there was listings of quote unquote China cups, which might be a reference to those small liquor cups. But I also want to be very clear for like these Chinese language ledgers that just because they are in Chinese, that doesn't mean the customers were exclusively Chinese American. The Jacksonville one doesn't really say much about the account and other information, but the Kamachan one does, and like make a note of different customers. And while I cannot prove this, there were accounts labeled with Guai or ghosts, which was one way that we know that Chinese Americans refers to Euro Americans. And, Kam Chong famously had a lot of Euro American customers and visitors. Um, for the Kublai ledgers, I did only look at Chinese American accounts, so we can't say definitively that any references to the Kublai store was purchased by Chinese Americans. For tools, they definitely showed up at the Kublai store. There were a lot of mentions of shovels and pig handles, whereas sledgehammer was absent. And similarly, we did also see shovel mentioned at Kamachang, and the shovels and hatchets and pig handles were listed in other Euro-American ledgers in Eastern Oregon. Unfortunately, due to time limitation, I could not finish comparing all the objects in the Kublai store in time for the presentation, but that's something I do hope to do for the rest of my dissertation, to look out for that. In addition, in the future, likely outside the scope of my dissertation, mostly because of time, I would love to look at the store ledgers in greater details to compare and contrast how often some of these objects were bought, especially by the same account customers, and even the cost, as opposed to this more general overview. So back to thinking about movement of objects. We know that there were these stores scattered across the landscape in both rural and informal towns of Outhouse, Browntown, Waldo, etc., that lasted only a few decades, as well as in these large urban towns of Jacksonville, Medford, Ashland, Wairika, etc. All these little places kind of creates these stopping points for Chinese American laborers to stop for access to goods and various services. With archaeology alone, we can see what kinds of objects are left behind at the sites, and we can speculate as to why based on the type of object. But by putting the archaeology in conversation with store ledgers, we also see what objects appear in the document and how often. Taking tools, for example, tools as a category, for examples, shovels and picks were purchased far more often than the sledgehammer, but they're obviously using sledgehammer. So together, this really paints a story of how far distance the sledgehammer may have traveled in comparison to shovels and picks. Basically, while archaeology alone can be very helpful in thinking about movement of objects and people, having written documents like ledgers just help make that argument so much stronger. Both archaeological sites and store ledgers help provide this visual of different stops that a Chinese American laborer would have traveled on this landscape, emphasizing a very lively, animated kind of story of Chinese Americans. And so this map that I kind of put together, like the stars represent known archaeological sites, whereas the triangles are like references to places that we found in the written document. Um, and thank you all so much for listening. This presentation could not have been possible without the support from a ton of individuals and all these organizations: Passport in Time, the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, Southern Laboratory Anthropology, Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, Stanford Archaeology Center, and funding provided by Oregon Archaeological Society and the Wintergren Foundation. And of course, thank you and shout out again to Portland Chinatown Museum for giving me this platform to share my work. Please let me know if you have questions or comments. Thank you.
Hi, Jocelyn. Do you want to stop screen sharing?
Yes. Okay. You're muted, Anna.
Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, that was wonderful. I have so many questions, but I want to make sure we let the folks in the audience get their comments and questions in first. And let me see. Sorry, I'm at high altitude, so I just ran upstairs when I heard a bang. Okay, let's see here. Sorry, where's the Q&A? There we go. All right. Well, I want to start out with the while we collect the Q&A, I want to start out with the incredible one of the first slides you had that talked about how these camps were cosmopolitan. And that was such an eye-opener to me. It reminded me of a similar eye-opener when I first started at the museum. Chelsea Rose introduced me to the term urban splaining, which, that was like world altering for me. But the cosmopolitan nature of these camps was really exciting to me. And I wonder if you could just, you know, talk a bit more about that, if that will feature in your larger project of the dissertation.
Just so that I can have like an actual focus on my dissertation, I do focus mostly on Chinese American population. But I do think it's really interesting to keep that cosmopolitan narrative in the back of our mind, especially since when we do talk about these different races and ethnicities, we like to think of them as being super isolated. And even like as people working on Chinese diaspora archaeology, we're super guilty of just talking about the Chinese diaspora. And so I think keeping that context of just how diverse it was, we don't necessarily have direct evidence of people interacting with each other, but it's like there's you might not be like having full conversations with your neighbor who don't speak the same language as you, but there's going to be some interaction, I'm sure, you
Sure.
know. So I think even though it's not like the focus of it, I think it's really important to keep that in mind just because we love to talk about these stories in isolation, but they're really not. And I think in the future, I would love to be able to work more on this idea of like multi-ethnic communities, just because of really how important it is.
Yeah. Well, and how I feel like your work is, I mean, it's always important, but right now when we have narratives demonizing immigrant populations, it's even more important. Um, and also to understand that it was a community and what were the fibers of that community. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't want to hog the question opportunity, but I did have one more question. It was about the tobacco, because this is such an art historical question, right? The tobacco label you found that matched up with some of the um, objects that you found. I may have a couple of specialists that look at graphic design for labels like that. Um, it looks like it was it was a tin canister, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So I know a couple design historians and art historians that focus on it, so we might be able to find more images for you if they would be helpful.
Oh yeah, that would be super cool.
Yeah,
Because we have that one tobacco tag that's like a little circle that says sun that I have no idea what it could be related to.
I'll send
Also because like sun just feels like could be anything, you know.
it to the Graduate Center's Hive Mind. We have
Awesome.
a serve that we when we have questions we can't answer, we go there. Um,
We have some nice comments from folks in the chat. So Jackie and Eric wanted to share that it was a great presentation from the Dalles. And then Dan Key said it was very interesting.
Thanks, guys.
I actually wanted to mention that I really appreciated you pointing out that we have in our mainstream culture the stereotype about Asian American men. Yet when we
Mhm.
look to the history, you have these early Chinese Americans doing really hard, strenuous labor, physical
Day trip.
labor. So it doesn't align. And I appreciate you pointing that out because
Yeah.
I mean, also when you pointed out the slope going up
Mhm.
and down, I mean, that really, you had to be in really peak physical condition to be able to do this work.
I know. And like again, we are our participants are on kind of the older side. I was just like honestly so impressed at everyone's ability. I think I was like one of the younger folks aside from that like one I think like teenager that we had. But I was struggling like everyone else was like kicking my ass on there like hiking up and down. I'm like, dang.
Really high altitude, right? And you're coming from sea level.
Yeah, I think it was pretty high. I don't remember exactly, but it was definitely a struggle.
Yeah.
So, you
That's
know.
not all you. That's altitude. That can really get like me. I was out of breath when I was turning my computer on. Um, I also loved the fact, to me, it's just so amazing that there were so many things found, but you only have so much time. So, like, the amount of stories that are out there, it's just so inspiring to think about all the histories, again, the hidden histories that we don't see. And this is like me really admitting my ignorance, but are you able to tell how large the metal thing is underneath the ground? And so you would make a choice to go after something that was larger than not, or
More off. So what we tend to do when we're metal detecting is that they would go around the metal detector and if they found a thing, they would basically try to dig it out
yeah,
to see like the object in itself. And I'm pretty sure most of the things we didn't connect were honestly can and nail fragments
yeah,
because what are we gonna do with another nail?
yeah, you can increase the stat, right?
Yeah.
So
Um,
wonderful. And I think I did see a couple more. Some folks are off to no kings, so that's great
yeah.
news. Um, Marcus earlier said he was thrilled with your audience, such a great and diverse audience from all over. Um, I'm Sarah and Capulani. I'm just having a hard time scrolling. My chat won't let me scroll. So, do we want
Oh,
to any other shout
yeah. So
outs?
we had from Carolyn, who said it was fascinating and thank you. From Roberta, thank you, Jocelyn. It was wonderful to revisit the site through your presentation. Waiting to join you on your next archaeological site. Do you want to maybe share about the public aspect of some of the projects that you're doing that it is accessible to people to visit? Because I think Roberta
Yeah.
had joined you for one of those site visits, right?
Well, Roberta was actually on the dig.
Oh,
And
nice.
I did I there was a picture of Roberta in the photos. I don't know if you guys caught it. She had her back to everyone. So I think you have to know what Roberta looks like to be able to catch it. But Roberta's one of those people that absolutely killed it. Like, oh my God, Roberta, go you.
That's her in all parts of her life.
Yeah. But this was a really like I would say I'm depending on how my career goes and depending on how like funding situation, I would love to do more exhibitions like this that is in partnership with like something like Passport in Time where just to be able to get folks out there with us. The thing about like mining sites like this is that they tend to not be nearly as accessible just because of like the distance and people that were with us like they either chose to drive like a really long time for their commute or they camped with us. And so you kind of have to be willing to either do long commutes or be willing to camp for like 4.5 days, of which are like really big ask for people. So I, I think like my colleagues are working on finding more sites that hopefully can be more accessible for the public. Um, Otherwise, I'm trying to be more creative with like how to get these sites out to the public, whether it's like presentations like this or, when I do visit Oregon, I try to bring like a little curated selection of artifacts to bring up to show people and so that people can get like a feel for like these objects. I think at some point it'd be really cool to do like a 3D print of like some of the maps and stuff like that. But it's kind of like TBD. But like my colleagues, Chelsea and Jackie and everyone, I know like we do work really hard on trying to make these sites more accessible to people and especially Chinese Americans in Oregon. Because it's important for people to be able to see these places that have the relevant histories. And that's also why for the Pit Project, we really made sure to like advertise through you guys and other like Chinese American organizations we knew so that we can try to encourage more Chinese Americans to join us. And the thank you photo I had up is the kind of photo of like all the Chinese Americans at site that I was like really proud of. Yeah.
We do have a question from Robert. Any oral histories? You mentioned there were Chinese miners there around the turn of the century.
We have some, and like I also have it in terms of like not oral history as like recording, but like people talking and like record, I don't know. Like the answer is yes, but it's also the thing about a place like Althouse is that it's so obscure. Um, and so it's actually kind of hard to get some of that information. And like they can, I know some of it is like buried in like the small town museums. And so this is where, being based out of the Bay Area, California, I've been incredibly grateful to my colleagues in Oregon that are willing to go to like the small museums and the historical societies to get some of that information for me. So the short answer is yes, they kind of exist, but the long answer is that unfortunately they're harder to get to. And so I'm sure there's more information on Chinese miners that exists in the oral history format in this area. I just don't have access to it right now.
We have another question from Wing Choi. Do you ever use AI as a tool to help identify carved Chinese characters, old handwriting, or hard to identify objects?
I have not. Um, I think it's a great thing to consider. And I'm just trying to figure out how to use, I guess, AI productively in my research. Yeah. But it's something great to consider. Thank you for that suggestion.
We also have some nice comments about the presentation from Marcus. Far out. Great presentation, Jay. And then from Horatio, thank you, Jocelyn. It was a very enlightening talk.
Yeah, it was wonderful. So many positive comments, lots of applause icons as you finished. I'm so looking forward to seeing you when you're in Portland and also to see the dissertation when it's finally done. I'm so excited for that. But congratulations on today. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
I felt like we always talk about a former staffer at the museum, Jennifer Fang, how incredible her presentations are, and I feel like yours was right there with her.
Well,
So
thank
thank you.
you.
It relevant to present day. It was fabulous. Before we go, I just want to make sure if there are any other questions. Um, uh, I do want to just say you might want to think about touching base with SETI, the Creative and Emergent Technologies Institute, when you're in town because they do a lot that could bring those objects to, closer to folks. It's just
Yeah,
um, and when you said 3D printing and they do AR and VR,
that's true.
just help me remember to make sure to set up a meeting with you guys.
Will do.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna.
Of course. All right, it looks like I'm so sorry. I can't scroll in my chat, so I'm reliant on oh, it just started working. There we go.
I
Uh
think Horatio's comment is the last one in the chat at the moment.
okay, great. So he says, "Thank you, Jocelyn. It was a very enlightening talk." And I do agree wholeheartedly. Well, we've already lost a few of our audience members to the No Kings rallies. So I think I'm going to wrap up so that folks, if they are attempting to get there, can get there. And Jocelyn, I know you probably are excited to see Emily soon. Or is it Emily, right?
Yeah, Emily.
Emmy. So I'll wrap up now. So a big Portland Chinatown Museum thank you to our presenter, Jocelyn Lee, and our wonderful audience for joining us today. If you'd like to rewatch this program, share it with others, or, watch it all together. A recording will be made available next week. And just a reminder that today's presentation marks the conclusion of the six-part Hidden History series. Thank you to the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, our fantastic presenters, and everyone who has joined us in learning more about the early history of our Chinese communities in Oregon. And I also want to make sure that we do not miss this opportunity to say a big Portland Chinatown Museum thank you to Kapiolani Lee, who makes all of this possible, working hard behind the scenes for all of these wonderful presentations. So before we sign off, we invite everyone to visit and share our YouTube and Vimeo pages for access to all of our Hidden Histories recordings, including our 2021 Hidden Histories program. And if you've enjoyed Hidden Histories, please let us know. Your feedback helps us plan our future programming. Lastly, please visit our website for details on 2 new temporary exhibitions, the Chinese Congregations of Portland's Chinatown's Past, and this is one in a part of series, what Roberta Wong is calling a memory lab. It's really a beautiful and I think profound project that she's working on. And then another exhibition in the main hall, Frances Mei-Hua Lee, Symbols of the New Year. Frances was a Portlander and a volunteer at Lansu Chinese Garden who just has an incredible oeuvre. We will have a larger retrospective of her work, but these were her Lunar New Year specific images. We look forward to seeing all of you, both virtually and in person. And if you are going out today to the rallies, please stay safe. And thank you again to Jocelyn. It was really a wonderful presentation. Take care, everyone.